She stood at that anchor desk for over 2 decades. Millions of people woke up with her voice in their ears, and for a long time that felt like something you could count on. She was steady. She was trusted. She was the kind of presence that made the chaos of the world feel somehow just a little more manageable. And then one day she was gone, not the way anchors usually leave. There was no farewell tour, no slow, graceful fade into retirement. The announcement came quickly, and the words she used didn't sound like a career decision. They sounded heavier than that. They sounded like something she had been carrying quietly, privately, for a long time, and had finally allowed the world to see. Norah O'Donnell spent years sitting across from presidents, senators, survivors, and people who had seen things most of us never will. She asked the hard questions. She held her composure when the stories were almost too painful to tell. She was, in the truest sense, the person holding the room together. But here is the thing nobody talks about. What happens when the person who holds everyone else together is slowly falling apart on the inside? What happens when the anchor herself is the one who needs saving? The public farewell was graceful. It was emotional in the way that only real things are. On the surface, it looked like a woman stepping confidently into her next chapter. But those who watched carefully, who listened not just to the words but to the spaces between them, noticed something else. A weight that sat just beneath the surface. A pause that lasted a breath too long. A goodbye that felt less like a transition and more like a woman finally, carefully, putting down something she had been carrying alone for far too long. This is not a story about leaving a job. This is a story about what it truly costs to stay and what it finally, painfully took to walk away. There is a version of Norah O'Donnell that most people know. She is sharp, composed, and precise. Every word measured, every expression controlled. For years, that version of her showed up every weeknight on CBS Evening News. And before that, in the mornings on CBS This Morning, and before that. Across decades of political reporting that took her from the White House to the campaign trail to the very center of American journalism. She built her reputation the slow, real way, not through a single viral moment, not through controversy or spectacle, through consistency, through presence. Through the kind of quiet, daily commitment that doesn't always get celebrated loudly, but earns something far more lasting than applause. It earns trust. Norah grew up in San Antonio, Texas. She was the daughter of a military father, which meant that discipline wasn't something she read about in a book. It was the air she breathed from the very beginning. She went on to study at Georgetown University, where she majored in philosophy, which, when you think about it, is a quietly fascinating foundation for someone who would spend her entire career asking hard questions about power, truth, and what people owe each other. There was always something more deliberate about her, something that ran deeper than the bright lights and the breaking news ticker. She joined NBC News as a Capitol Hill correspondent in the late 1990s, and that is where she truly found her footing. Washington political reporting is not a gentle world. It demands speed and accuracy and the rare ability to navigate rooms full of people who are all simultaneously managing their own image. She moved through it with rare steadiness. So much so that CBS came calling, and she made the move that would shape the most defining chapter of her career. By the time she became the anchor of CBS Evening News in 2019, Norah was not stepping into that chair as someone trying to prove herself. She was a veteran. A journalist of real substance walking into one of the most historically significant roles in American broadcasting. A chair that Walter Cronkite once occupied. A chair that carries the weight of history in every single broadcast. And she filled it quietly and deliberately and with the kind of seriousness the role deserved. But something else was happening at the same time. Something that the studio lights couldn't illuminate and that the camera couldn't capture. Something she didn't speak about publicly for a long time, not because she was being dishonest, but because some things take time to understand and even more courage to say out loud. The years at the anchor desk were not just professionally demanding. They were physically and emotionally consuming in ways that the audience never sees and rarely considers. The preparation before air, the late rewrites, the impossible task of distilling an entire burning world down into 22 minutes of coherent, responsible television every single night. The pressure to be everything, to be present, to be steady, without ever visibly cracking, not even once. She did it. For years she did it. But the body, no matter how disciplined the mind, always keeps score. To truly understand what Norah O'Donnell's departure meant, you have to understand what the job of a network evening news anchor actually is. Because from the outside, it can look deceptively simple. It can look like reading, like sitting in front of a camera and delivering information in a calm voice. But that description doesn't begin to touch the reality. The anchor of a major evening broadcast is the editorial center of gravity for an entire news organization. Every story that reaches air has been debated, fact-checked, rewritten, and approved, often with the anchor sitting at the center of that entire process. You are not simply a face. You are the voice of final judgment, and the weight of that is real. Norah took that responsibility seriously in a way that people around her noticed and respected. She was not there for the performance of journalism. She was there for the journalism itself. She pushed for stories that mattered. She asked the kind of difficult editorial questions that sent reporters back to do more work before a piece could move forward. That level of commitment is admirable. It is also the kind of thing that wears on a person in ways that are slow and invisible at first, and then suddenly very hard to ignore. At the same time, CBS Evening News was fighting for its footing in a media landscape that was shifting rapidly beneath everyone. Streaming had changed how people consumed information. Social media had fragmented the audience in ways that no single broadcast could fully recapture. The pressure to compete in that environment, to honor the legacy of the broadcast while also fighting for relevance in a fractured world, landed most heavily on the anchor's shoulders. There were reports of institutional tension, questions about the direction of the broadcast. The kind of friction that is common in large media organizations, but that feels intensely personal when your face and name are the ones attached to the outcome. None of it was explosive. None of it was the kind of drama that fills tabloid pages, but it was real, it was present, and somewhere beneath all of that professional turbulence, something else was quietly unfolding. Something that had nothing to do with ratings or editorial politics. Something was happening to Norah herself, in her body, in her health, in the private life that existed beyond the studio walls. And for a while, she managed it the way that deeply driven, highly disciplined people so often manage things they don't yet fully understand. She kept showing up. In 2023, Norah O'Donnell announced she would be leaving CBS Evening News. The announcement was delivered with the carefully chosen language that the industry tends to use when it wants transitions to feel smooth and inevitable. But the timing felt unusual. The circumstances raised quiet questions among those paying attention. And the way she spoke about it, the particular words she chose, the pauses that came between them, didn't carry the energy of a woman who had simply decided it was time for something new. She spoke about her health, carefully, gently, without surrendering more than she was ready to give. According to reports at the time, Norah had been navigating a health condition that had been significantly affecting her daily life for some time. The full details were not immediately public, and she had every right to that privacy. But enough emerged, through her own measured words and through those who were close to the situation, to paint a picture of a woman who had been quietly managing something serious, something real. Something that took genuine effort to contain, all while continuing to anchor one of the most watched broadcasts in the country every single weeknight. Think about that for a moment. Every night she sat in that chair. Every night she delivered the news to millions of people who had no idea what she was carrying beneath the composure. That is not weakness. That is a specific and deeply human kind of endurance, the kind that most people are never asked to exercise, the kind that takes something from you every single day. But endurance always has a cost. And there comes a point, not a moment of failure, not a collapse, but a quiet and honest moment of reckoning, when a person has to ask whether continuing to endure is truly the same thing as living. For Norah, that question eventually arrived, and she answered it. The condition that Norah has spoken about, carefully and selectively, touches on challenges that fall within the broader territory of chronic and autoimmune health conditions. She has not made a complete public medical disclosure, and she has no obligation to do so. But what has emerged through her own voice, and through people familiar with her situation, suggests a road that was long and difficult, and far less visible than her public life. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of chronic illness, particularly when it affects someone in public life. People look at a person who appears composed and capable, who shows up consistently, who speaks with clarity and confidence, and they conclude that everything must be fine on the inside. That the polished exterior reflects a healthy interior. That assumption, more often than not, is completely wrong. For Norah, the distance between how she appeared and how she actually felt was something she managed with the same iron discipline she had applied to everything else throughout her career. But discipline is not a treatment. Discipline can hold a wall standing for a long time, it cannot hold it standing forever. What made her situation especially difficult was the specific nature of the work itself. Television news does not accommodate bad days. You cannot quietly call in sick to the CBS Evening News the way most people can send an email to their manager and stay home. The schedule is fixed. The preparation never truly stops. The perceived stakes inside the culture of that industry feel enormous every single night, and she had spent years building an identity around being the one who was reliable. The one who was always there. The steady voice that people could count on, and that identity, as meaningful and earned as it was, had quietly become part of what made stopping feel almost impossible. Because stopping, even for survival, even when it was the only reasonable choice, can feel, to a person wired the way she is wired, like something dangerously close to giving up. It wasn't. It was the complete opposite. But that truth is not always accessible when you are standing inside the pressure of it. According to those who observed the situation closely, the decision to step back was not a sudden one. It came slowly, through medical guidance, through honest reflection, through the kind of difficult personal clarity that only arrives after you have exhausted every other possibility. Her final broadcast was something people experienced differently once they understood what was beneath it. She thanked the people she had worked alongside for years. She reflected on the stories that had stayed with her, the ones that had mattered most, the ones that reminded her why she had chosen this work in the first place. She spoke about the responsibility of journalism, and it didn't sound like a prepared speech. It sounded like a belief. Like something she had carried in her chest for a very long time and was now finally saying out loud, without the weight of tomorrow's broadcast pressing down on every word. There were tears. Not performed ones, not the kind that arrive on cue. The kind that surface from somewhere deep, from a place that has been under sustained pressure for years and is finally being allowed just for a moment to breathe. What moved people who went back and watched that broadcast again was not the emotion itself. It was the composure surrounding it. The way she held herself together even in that moment, and how beneath that composure, if you were really watching, you could feel the full weight of everything she was choosing not to say. The years. The cost, the love for the work that had made the cost feel justified for so long. And the moment she finally, quietly, understood that love alone is not a sustainable foundation for the kind of sacrifice the work had been asking of her. She had spoken before her departure about what it meant to be a woman in broadcast journalism. About the particular, persistent pressure of occupying a highly visible space that was not always built with you in mind. About what it required just to be taken seriously in certain rooms. All of that was real. All of it had been layered on top of everything else she was already carrying. Her farewell was not simply a moment in television history. It was a portrait, quiet and honest and human, of what it looks like when a person of genuine capability reaches the point where capability is no longer the most important thing. Where health and life, and the very simple and very necessary need to be okay, finally take the place that legacy had been occupying. For many people watching, that moment was not sad. It was something they had needed, without knowing they needed it, to see. The way the media covered Norah's departure, like most coverage of public figures at moments of transition, tended toward simple stories. It was either a sad story about illness taking something from someone, or an uplifting story about a woman courageously choosing herself. Both of those framings carry truth. Neither one fully holds the texture of what actually happened. Because what actually happened was layered and complicated and honest in the way that real life always is, and simplified narratives almost never are. There was grief in it. Not the grief of losing something harmful, but the specific ache of leaving something that had shaped and defined her for decades. When you spend that long building something, a reputation, a purpose, a sense of self that is deeply woven into a particular role and a particular place, walking away from it even when you must. Even when every signal is telling you to go, involves a quiet loss that doesn't have a simple name. There was also, according to those who know her well, relief, real relief, the kind that comes after a very long time of holding on, the kind that doesn't arrive until you finally let yourself stop. And there was uncertainty, because chronic health conditions do not simply resolve once the primary stressor is removed. The work continues quietly, the medical management, the personal recalibration, the daily effort of giving a body the attention it has been asking for and not receiving. She has spoken about wanting to be present with her family, with her children, To show up in her personal life the way she had always shown up professionally, fully, without reservation. Those words in another context might sound like the standard, rehearsed language of a public exit. Given what she was actually navigating, they carry a different kind of weight entirely. There are broader questions embedded in her story too, not questions of guilt or blame, but honest questions about systems. About what the culture of television news asks of the people who carry it. About an industry that treats endurance through illness as a mark of strength, and stepping back for health as something requiring justification and apology. About how many other people in that world and far beyond it are doing what Norah did for years, holding themselves together under bright, visible lights, while quietly, invisibly, falling apart in the places no one thinks to look. Those questions are uncomfortable, they do not have clean answers, but they are worth sitting with because they belong to all of us, not just to her. There is something about Norah O'Donnell's story that exists beyond the broadcast, beyond the diagnosis, beyond the departure itself. It is the story of a specific and deeply human kind of cost. The kind that never makes it into ratings reports or industry awards. The kind that builds slowly and silently in the spaces between the work, in the body, in the mind. In the quiet hours when the performance stops and the real person has to simply exist without an audience. She gave a version of herself to that desk every night for years. A version that was measured and professional and deeply trusted. And behind that version was a full, complicated, struggling human being who was slowly and privately coming to understand that commitment, no matter how genuine, cannot protect you forever from what the body is asking you to hear. Her story reaches people who have never been anywhere near a television studio. It reaches them because most people, at some point in their lives, know what it feels like to hold something together well past the point where it makes sense to do so. To keep showing up because stopping feels like surrender. To treat endurance as a virtue and rest as a kind of weakness, and to carry that belief quietly until it begins to cost too much. Norah's story asks a different question. It asks what we actually owe ourselves. Not as a rejection of purpose or dedication, but as a simple, necessary, and long overdue acknowledgement that we are not built to endure without limit, that the body is not a machine. That health is not secondary to achievement, it is the ground beneath it, and without it, nothing else can stand the way we want it to stand. She remains, by every account, a journalist in the deepest sense. That instinct, once it takes root in a person, does not simply leave. But she is also now someone who made the choice to prioritize herself at the exact moment when the cost of not doing so had become something she could no longer afford to pay. There is a quiet kind of courage in that, not the loud, cinematic kind that gets celebrated in the moment. The kind that is small and private and incredibly difficult and in the end completely necessary. The story is not finished. Real stories never are. There will be more chapters ahead, more decisions, more days that look simpler from the outside than they feel from within. But for now, she stepped back from the light. And in doing so, she gave a great many people who are living in the dark a quiet, unspoken permission to consider doing the same. If this story stayed with you, if it stirred something you have been carrying, or reminded you of someone who never stops showing up no matter what it costs them, leave a thought in the comments below. These stories matter because they are real, and because they reflect something most of us understand deeply but rarely find the words to say. If you want more stories told this way, subscribe and stay close. There is more to come, and it will always be worth your time.